On the morning of May 14, 1858, in the slave market at Natchez, Mississippi, a black man named Elias Voss was tied to a hitching post and ordered to watch his wife be sold. That is where this story begins. Not with justice, not with mercy, not even with hope. It begins with a crowd. It begins with men in clean coats and polished boots gathering under a clear southern sky as if they had come to inspect horses, timber, or cotton bales. It begins with a clerk wetting the tip of his pencil. It begins with the auctioneer lifting his hand and turning a human life into rhythm, numbers, and spectacle. It begins with the kind of American ritual that polite history has too often described in soft language, as if commerce could cleanse cruelty. Elias stood with a hemp rope cutting into both wrists. The skin there had already been rubbed raw from the march into town. His shirt was torn at the shoulder. There was dried blood behind one ear where an overseer had struck him with a pistol butt the night before. He was 32 years old, broad through the chest, scarred across the back, and silent because silence was the only thing still his. Beside the platform, a trader from Louisiana had told him twice to keep his eyes down. Elias did not obey. He looked up. He looked because his wife was on that platform. Her name was Naomi Voss. She was 28. She had a narrow face, steady dark eyes, and the posture of a woman who had been denied dignity for years and had still refused to surrender it. She wore a plain faded blue dress that had been mended so many times the seams no longer matched. Her hands were folded once, tightly, at her waist, until the auctioneer yanked one arm forward and told the buyers to look at her shoulders, her teeth, her hips, her age. He said she was sound. He said she was obedient. He said she had no child attached. He said it the way men at these sales always said such things, with the false brightness of a merchant praising inventory. There had been a debt. That was the official reason. The owner of the Bayou Marrow plantation in Concordia Parish, Louisiana, where Elias and Naomi had been kept since 1853, had gambled against a bad cotton season, then borrowed against people when the harvest failed him. This is how the record would phrase it in ledgers and probate notes. Debt, transfer, asset liquidation. But the moral fact beneath the paperwork was simpler. A white man had mismanaged his life, and a black woman was being sold to cover the difference. That morning, the men who came to bid did not arrive ashamed. They arrived interested. Elias remembered them because he forced himself to remember them. The first was a sugar planter with pale lashes and a silver-headed cane, a man called August Renshaw from Iberville Parish, who lifted 2 fingers without removing the cigar from his mouth. The second was a trader named Lucian Pike, thick-necked, red-faced, with a gold watch chain stretched across his waistcoat. He bid fast, casually, with the indifference of long practice. Men like Pike fed on separation. They did not merely participate in the trade. They specialized in fracture. Husband from wife, mother from son, sister from brother, then onward to the next town. The third was a broker from Vicksburg named Hollis Creed, who did not smile when he bid. Men like him were worse in a quieter way. They did not need theatrics. They understood the market. They understood timing. They understood how to wait half a second longer than everyone else, then raise a hand at the exact moment hope began to die in somebody else's chest. And there were others. A rice factor. A parish judge bidding through an agent. A man in a cream vest with ink stains on his fingers who kept whispering prices to someone behind him. A hotel owner. A stocky buyer with a scar down his jaw. A bookkeeper near the platform who marked each number as if this were routine, which it was. That is the point. The obscene thing was not only the sale. It was how ordinary the sale had become. Naomi did not scream. That mattered to Elias. He would remember that too. She turned her head once, just once, and found him in the crowd. The rope held him upright, but anger kept him standing. There are moments when a human being is reduced to evidence. Elias, bound and bleeding, became evidence of a husband made powerless. Naomi, displayed beneath the hammer, became evidence of a system that required witnesses to humiliation in order to preserve obedience. The auction was not only about money. It was theater. It was instruction. It was a public lesson delivered in flesh. The bidding climbed $900. $950. $1,000. At $1,050, the crowd leaned in, not because a life was at stake, because a price was rising. The auctioneer laughed once and called Naomi fine property. That phrase would live inside Elias like a nail. Fine property. A wife reduced to condition, to resale potential, to breeding calculation, to field endurance, to kitchen labor, to whatever lie the next man needed in order to turn appetite into ownership. A boy no older than 14 stood near the steps holding a tin cup of water for the buyers. He watched the bidding too. That is how corruption survives across generations. Some men learn cruelty by command. Others learn it by proximity. They watch older men clap, bargain, inspect, joke, and then mistake participation for adulthood. At $1,100, August Renshaw withdrew. At 11:25, Lucien Pike smirked and nodded. At 11:50, Hollis Creed raised his hand. Naomi closed her eyes for one brief second. That second stayed with Elias longer than the gunshots, longer than the whips, longer than hunger. He would later forget the weather on certain days, the names of towns where he hid, the faces of men who hired him, the dates of lesser injuries. But he would not forget that single second. Because it was the second in which his wife understood that the crowd had decided her future without once asking whether she belonged to herself. Then came the final bid. $1,175, raised not by Pike, not by Creed, but by a man Elias had barely noticed at first. Tall, narrow, immaculate, standing farther back under the awning in a black coat despite the heat. His name, Elias would learn later, was Silas Whitmore of St. Helena Parish, Louisiana. He did not wave. He did not call out. He only lifted his right hand to chest height like a man acknowledging a servant. The auctioneer slammed it down. Sold. That was the sound Elias heard in his sleep for years afterward, not the whole sentence. Not the noise of the crowd, just that final word, sold, the language of markets, the language that lets evil disguise itself as transaction. Sold, as if the thing transferred had no memory, no vows, no soul, no name worth preserving. Naomi was taken from the platform within seconds. Speed was part of the method. No pause, no human interval. No room for final words. One handler pulled her by the arm. Another moved between her and Elias before either could speak. The trader from Louisiana stepped close to Elias and told him he should be grateful he had not been sold with her. That sentence, too, deserves to be remembered. Slaveholders often called survival a gift, when what they had really done was manufacture a deeper form of torture. Elias lunged once. The rope snapped him back. A rifle butt struck him across the ribs. Someone in the crowd laughed. Someone else said, "Hold him still." This is why names matter. This is why faces matter. Because crowds commit crimes under the protection of blur. But no crime should be allowed to hide inside the word crowd. Elias watched Naomi disappear behind a wagon stacked with feed sacks and travel trunks. He saw only the back of her dress once more before the wagon line swallowed her. Then she was gone, and that should have been the end of it. For most men, the story would end there. Another broken husband. Another vanished wife. Another sale entered in a book and forgotten by everyone except the people it destroyed. But Elias did not forget. He studied every face, every hand that rose, every mouth that named a price, every man who stood close enough to smell her fear and still chose to participate. He remembered the cane, the cigar, the gold watch chain, the scar, the ink-stained fingers, the cold black coat at the back. He remembered the price. He remembered the date. And before the summer was over, one of those men would begin to learn what memory can become when grief is denied burial. If you're listening from Mississippi, Louisiana, Georgia, South Carolina, or anywhere the old auction blocks still cast a shadow, comment where you're from and tell me, should the names of the buyers be remembered as carefully as the names of the people they tried to erase? Before Elias Voss was tied to a post in Natchez on May 14, 1858, before men in linen coats turned his wife into a bidding contest, there had been years of smaller crimes. Not smaller in pain, smaller only in the way history often records them. A beating entered nowhere, a child buried without a marker, a marriage tolerated only until the ledger demanded otherwise. That is how the machine worked. It did not run on one spectacular act alone. It ran on daily theft. Elias and Naomi had been kept at Bayou Marrow Plantation since November 1853, a cotton and corn operation spread over low ground in Concordia Parish, Louisiana, about 12 miles south of Vidalia. The land belonged to Gerard Weller, a planter whose father had left him acreage, enslaved labor, and enough borrowed prestige to pretend he had built something himself. Men like Weller called themselves providers, patriarchs, stewards of order. Strip away the language and the truth is plain. He was a debtor with armed authority over people he did not own in any moral sense, but did own under the law. Elias had been brought there at age 27 from a smaller property outside Opelousas after a succession sale broke apart the people on that estate. Naomi arrived 6 months later, purchased through a trader's yard in Baton Rouge in April 1854. They did not choose each other in freedom. People in bondage rarely had that luxury, but they chose each other in the only way still available to them, by standing close when the horn blew at dawn, by sharing scraps of food, by carrying each other's names like contraband. By late 1855, they were husband and wife in the only ceremony that mattered to the enslaved quarters. Witnesses, vows, memory. No minister with legal standing, no paper recognized by the state. Only the spoken promise that each belonged first to the other, regardless of what the plantation ledger claimed. Bayou Mero was built to exhaust bodies and erase attachments. The main house stood on a slight rise above the fields, painted white with galleries front and back and green shutters imported from New Orleans. Behind it lay the smokehouse, kitchen yard, gin shed, mule barn, blacksmith lean-to, and the row of slave cabins along a drainage ditch that stank in summer. The cabins were cypress plank boxes with mud chimneys and leaking roofs. In January, the cold came through the cracks. In August, the mosquitoes rose so thick from the wet ground that children slept under smoke and still woke bitten raw. The workday began before sunrise. In picking season, the horn sounded around 4:30. In winter, ditching and fence repair began after a quick rationing of cornmeal. Naomi worked part of the year in the fields and part in the laundry and weaving room, depending on the house's needs. Elias cut timber, repaired levees, drove wagons, cleared canebrake, and was sometimes hired out to neighboring farms because Weller liked cash more than consistency. That detail matters. Hire-out arrangements did not merely stretch labor. They severed what little routine enslaved families managed to build. A man gone 3 nights. A woman shifted to the house. A child left with an elder. Disruption was not an accident. It was another instrument of control. Still, Elias and Naomi made a life in fragments. In the spring of 1856, they planted collards behind Cabin 7 in a strip of ground they had no right to call theirs. Naomi saved onion ends in a rag and pushed them into the soil after dark. Elias carved her a small wooden comb from pecan scrap. She washed his shirt in lye so harsh it cracked her fingers. He bartered with a stable hand for a broken tin cup and hammered it straight enough for her to use. These details matter because the old lie says enslaved people were merely surviving units inside an economic system. No. They were building human bonds under siege. The crime was not only forced labor, it was the deliberate war against ordinary domestic life. By September 1856, Naomi was pregnant. No ledger records what that meant to her, but the quarters would have understood the double nature of such news. Joy laced with terror. A child might mean one more reason to endure. It also meant one more life exposed to sale, disease, punishment, inheritance disputes, and the appetites of the market. Enslaved mothers were expected to nourish what the law intended to commodify. That contradiction should never be described as normal. It was sadism in administrative form. The baby, a girl, was born in late April 1857 during a violent storm that flooded the ditch behind the cabins. They named her Mercy. She lived 41 days. There was fever in the quarters that summer, a cough first, then heat in the skin, then a limp stillness. 2 infants died in June. Mercy died on June 11, 1857, wrapped in cloth Naomi had torn from the hem of her own dress. Weller allowed no work stoppage beyond the hours needed to dig the grave beyond the tree line east of the cabins. Elias went back to the field the same afternoon. Naomi returned to the wash kettles the next morning because another woman had already been threatened with whipping for falling behind. This, too, was part of the plantation's real economy. Grief denied until it rotted inward. Witnesses later remembered that after Mercy died, something in Naomi hardened, not into cruelty, into clarity. She stopped lowering her eyes for the mistress of the house, Celia Weller, a woman who liked to speak of Christian duty while ordering rations cut for the sick. She became more careful with words but less willing to perform gratitude. She once told another woman in the weaving room, quietly, that the house wanted broken people because broken people were easier to sort and sell. A warning like that could cost a person's skin. On Bayou Mero, almost every truth carried a penalty. By early 1858, Gerard Weller's finances were failing. The cotton crop of 1857 had underperformed after flooding and boll rot. Weller had borrowed heavily through a Natchez factor named Edwin Bale, pledging future output and, when that failed to satisfy the lenders, pledging enslaved property as collateral. Here is where the moral rot becomes especially visible. The same men who spoke loudly about honor built their solvency on mortgaging black bodies. They borrowed against pregnancies, against backs, against marriages, against the hands that fed them. Debt on paper became terror in the quarters. In February 1858, Bale came to inspect the place. He arrived in a carriage with ledger books, legal papers, and the expression of a man auditing livestock. He asked ages, sexes, work capacities, current ailments, and whether any women had children attached. That term should be remembered exactly as they used it, attached, as if a child were a burden on value rather than evidence of a mother's life. Bale made marks beside 6 names. Naomi's was among them. Not because she had done anything wrong, not because she was old or infirm. The opposite. She was 28, healthy after recovery, skilled in field and domestic labor, and now childless. In the market logic of the slave South, that made her liquid. Elias understood the danger before Naomi did, or perhaps he only admitted it sooner. He had seen inspection looks before, men pretending not to examine while measuring every shoulder and wrist. He began asking questions in whispers. A drayman from Vidalia told him that Bayou Mero was said to be under pressure from creditors. An older man in the blacksmith shed said Weller had been gambling in river towns again. A cook from the big house overheard Celia Weller complain that some people would have to go before summer. That was how sale announced itself on plantations, not with honesty, but with fragments. A dropped remark. A new inventory. Extra paper in the master's desk. A trader's horse at the gate. In March 1858, Naomi was moved from laundry duty back to the house for 2 weeks. Not for promotion. For display. Celia Weller made her wear a cleaner dress when visitors came. She was ordered to carry trays through the back parlor and stand straighter than usual. One evening, Elias saw 2 men he did not know speaking with Gerard Weller on the gallery, while Naomi was made to walk past them twice. Men appraising a woman while pretending to discuss finance. That is how civilized theft dresses itself. With courtesy, with gloves, with lowered voices, with women turned into collateral under chandeliers. Naomi knew then. That night, in cabin 7, with the rest of the row gone quiet and only the insects sounding outside, she told Elias she believed they were going to sell her. He told her he would run with her before he let that happen. She told him no too quickly, which is how he knew she had already measured the risks. Patrols, dogs, river crossings, swamps, informers, hunger. A captured man whipped half to death. A captured woman sold farther south in punishment. Bayou Mero stood inside a system designed to make escape look like madness and submission look like the only rational choice. That was one of slavery's cruelest achievements, forcing victims to calculate survival inside a field of engineered impossibilities. They still planned. Through late March and April, they stored crusts of cornbread, a fishhook, flint, and 2 stolen nails inside a hollow beneath the cabin floor. Elias mapped routes in his head toward the tensest swamps. Naomi said that if they were separated before they could flee, he was not to let them kill his memory. She made him repeat names with her: Gerard Weller, Edwin Bale, the overseer Tom Blevins, every trader who visited. Every man who looked too long. This was not yet a revenge pact. It was an accounting practice of the oppressed. When the law serves the buyer, memory becomes the first archive of the condemned. Then came the final confirmation. On May 9, 1858, 5 days before the Natchez sale, Naomi was ordered to pack no more than 1 extra dress and a shawl. Weller told the overseer within Elias's hearing that the woman would fetch a good number in Mississippi because she had no encumbrance and no visible defect. Those words should be preserved in all their filth. No encumbrance. He meant her baby was dead. He meant her grief improved her resale value. Elias struck Blevins that same evening after the overseer laughed about it. The blow was quick and desperate, more insult than injury, but on a plantation insult from an enslaved man could trigger execution. Elias was beaten, bound, and locked overnight in the old tool room. Naomi was not permitted to see him. At dawn on May 10th, he was dragged out, bloodied, and warned that one more act of defiance would see him sold to the cane fields or shot in the yard. Weller changed course only because he wanted the sale in Natchez to proceed without further disruption. Profit first, punishment after. That was the real hierarchy. On May 12th, Naomi was taken by wagon toward the river crossing under guard. Elias saw her leave from the far side of the mule lot with his hands swollen and split. She did not cry out. She turned once and touched 2 fingers to her chest, then lowered her hand, a signal, a vow, a command to remember. 2 days later, in Natchez, he would be forced to watch strangers bid on her body. But the auction did not begin there. It began in the cabins, in the debt papers, in the dead child's grave, in the inspections, in the cultivated helplessness of men who called their own greed necessity. By the time Naomi climbed the platform on May 14, 1858, the crime was already old. The crowd merely made it public. On the night of May 14, 1858, after the auction yard in Natchez emptied and the buyers returned to their hotels, counting rooms, and river cabins, Elias Voss was not taken back to Bayou Merrow immediately. Gerard Weller had business to settle with the factor Edwin Bale, and a chained black man was easier to store than transport. So Elias was dragged behind a feed warehouse near the riverfront, thrown into a narrow plank holding shed used for mules, cotton hands in transit, and anyone the market needed to keep alive without recognizing as fully human. That detail matters. Slavery did not only degrade people in the field, it built temporary pens, side rooms, iron rings, and hidden corners in commercial towns so that humiliation could continue between transactions. The auction block was public theater. The holding shed was the back room where the same system removed its smile and showed its actual face. Elias lay on damp boards with one rib likely cracked, both wrists stripped raw, and his left eye swollen almost shut. There were 3 other men in the shed that night. One had been caught attempting to flee upriver with forged travel papers. One was a teenager from Adams County being shipped to Texas with 2 brothers already sold away. The third was old enough to have white in his beard and said nothing at all. There was no blanket. No lamp, only river smell, mule sweat, blood, and the sound of steamboat whistles crossing the dark. Elias did not sleep. This is where a sentimental storyteller would speak of brokenness, of despair, of a man reduced to shadow. But that would be too easy, and also untrue. He was wounded, yes, he was desperate, but something more dangerous had happened inside him that day. The auction had not emptied him, it had organized him. He began with the faces. He forced himself to rebuild the sale from first bid to last. August Renshaw with the silver cane, Lucian Pike with the watch chain, Hollis Creed, thin-lipped and patient. The scarred buyer near the rail, the ink-stained clerk, the man in the cream vest whispering numbers. And farther back, almost composed enough to be missed, Silas Whitmore in the black coat, the man who raised his hand last and took Naomi from him. Elias repeated the names in silence until they stopped sounding like noise and became markers. He assigned them to features: Renshaw, pale lashes, cigar smoke; Pike, red face, thick neck, gold chain; Creed, narrow jaw, still eyes; Whitmore, black coat, controlled hand, no wasted movement. He went over the bids too: 900, 950, 1,000, 1150, 1175. Price is wound. Price is evidence. He understood, even before he had a plan, that memory would be his first weapon because law would not be. Before dawn, a stable boy opened the shed and threw in a bucket of water and scraps of stale bread. The boy could not have been older than 16. He stared at Elias's bruised face and said, "You should have kept still." That sentence deserves attention, not because it was unique, but because it was common. Tyranny survives by teaching the powerless to mistake obedience for wisdom. Keep still. Don't resist. Don't make it worse. Advice like that passes for realism under systems designed by criminals. Elias said nothing. He took the water, washed blood from his mouth, and kept memorizing. By May 16, 1858, he was back at Bayou Merrow. Weller did not kill him. That, too, had an economic explanation. Elias was still useful. A man could be beaten hard and still be worth labor. A dead man was only a warning. A living man with scars was both warning and asset. So Weller had him whipped in the yard before the quarters, 20 lashes by Overseer Tom Blevins, for assault and insolence. Celia Weller watched from the gallery. No one spoke Naomi's name. Her absence hung over the place like smoke, and that silence was deliberate. Plantations trained the enslaved to continue working around disappearance as if disappearance were weather. Elias survived the whipping because survival had become an obligation. For the next 2 weeks, he worked with fever in his back and blood stiffening his shirt. He cut fence posts by day and built something else by night, a list without paper. He had no book, no pencil, no hiding place safe enough for writing. So he used repetition. He tied names to rhythms, to steps, to tasks. 3 blows of the axe, 1 name. Lift, drag, breathe, 1 face. August Renshaw, Lucian Pike, Hollis Creed, Edwin Bale, Silas Whitmore. He added others from Bayou Merrow itself, Gerard Weller, Celia Weller, Tom Blevins, because the crime did not begin at auction, and he knew that. One old man in the quarters called Moses Reed noticed the change in him first. Moses had survived 3 plantations, a chain gang, and 1 attempted sale blocked only by cholera in the parish. He understood damaged men the way battlefield surgeons understand fractures. Late one night in early June, while others slept, Moses told Elias that a man who stares too hard at the same fire either becomes ash or iron. Then he asked him which one he meant to be. Elias answered with a question of his own. How far is St. Helena from Natchez by River Road? That was enough. Moses did not ask why. Enslaved people often knew when to leave a thought untouched so it could survive. Instead, he told Elias what he knew. St. Helena Parish lay eastward, beyond lines of pine and bad roads, where certain planters kept private holdings away from easy inspection. He had heard the name Whitmore once before, maybe from a trader out of Baton Rouge, maybe from a drayman hauling supplies, a house with guards, a reputation for discipline, not much else. But for Elias, even rumor mattered. Rumor was often the only map allowed to the oppressed. Through June and July of 1858, Bayou Merrow sank deeper into its summer routine. The fields blistered, the ditch behind the cabins thickened with insects. Weller drank more openly. Bale's letters came faster. Hired patrols passed twice in a month because 3 enslaved men from a nearby place had fled into the swamp. Under ordinary conditions, Elias might have waited too long, worn down by labor and surveillance. But the auction had altered his mathematics. He no longer measured risk against comfort. He measured it against permanent loss. On the night of July 22, 1858, after a storm rolled over Concordia Parish and washed out the West Road, Elias ran. He did not run in heroics. He ran half-starved with a stolen knife, a flint scrap, 2 crusts of cornbread, and a strip of salt pork hidden in his shirt. He slipped past the mule barn while thunder covered his movement. He crossed the drainage ditch on a fallen plank and crawled through canebrake until mud coated his chest. By dawn, he was in cypress swamp, waist-deep in black water, standing still whenever dogs sounded in the distance. There was no romance in escape, only insects, infection, and the constant arithmetic of fear. For 4 days he moved by night and hid by day in hollows, brush, and abandoned trappers' lean-tos. Once he stole turnips from a patch behind a poor white farm. Once he drank from a hoofprint filled by rainwater because the creek nearby was too exposed. On the 5th day, he found a camp of free black woodcutters working under contract near the Tensas River. One of them, a broad-shouldered man called Josiah Grimes, nearly turned him away, not from cruelty, but from caution. Harboring a fugitive could ruin every man there. But when Elias gave the name Bayou Merrow and said his wife had been sold in Natchez, something in Josiah shifted, not softening, recognition. He let Elias stay one night. That one night became the hinge on which the next years turned. Josiah had once worked around river depots and freight yards from Vidalia to New Orleans. He knew what fugitives needed more than pity. They needed redirection, new labor, altered names, and distance from the first search radius. He told Elias that planters always looked nearby first, then in obvious escape corridors, then among kin. So he advised the opposite. Head north for a time, not south. Work under white contractors if necessary. Keep no steady story. Never give the same name twice until you decide which name you want to live under. Elias left the camp with a rough hat, a patched coat, and a new surname, Cross. By August 1858, he was in western Tennessee working on a levee gang under the name Eli Cross. That work nearly killed him. Men sank in mud, broke ankles on shifting embankments, caught fever from stagnant water, and were paid less than promised if paid at all. But it also taught him something Bayou Merrow had not. Movement. Contractors, roustabouts, draymen, river guards, scouts, labor brokers, discharged soldiers, slave catchers, and bounty hunters all crossed the same roads, ferries, and camps. The South was not only a system of plantations, it was a network. Goods moved, people moved. Information moved with whoever learned how to hear it. Elias began listening like an investigator. At cook fires and hiring yards, he learned which traders moved people from Natchez to Baton Rouge, which firms supplied chains, which taverns hosted planters on market days, which sheriffs rented cells to slave dealers, which parishes had private roads and secluded houses. He discovered how often men in respectable business overlapped with traffickers in flesh. The merchant who sold feed might also keep auction records. The lawyer who filed deeds might also draft bills of sale. The preacher who denounced theft from the pulpit might dine with buyers after market. Slavery was not supported by a few spectacular villains alone. It was maintained by clerks, hosts, carriers, lenders, and men who liked to call themselves neutral. In February 1859, Elias enlisted under a false age and partial false name with a mounted border company operating between Arkansas and the Indian Territory. Not because he had suddenly become loyal to a nation that trafficked in his people. Because mounted work taught tracking, firearms discipline, reading terrain, and surviving with less noise. He learned hoof sign, camp sign, tobacco ash differences, broken grass patterns, and how men reveal themselves by routine more than by speech. He learned how pursuit works, how a careless fire can betray distance, how a saddle strap wears differently on a man who rides daily, how men hide where they think others are too lazy to look. These were not noble lessons. They came from violent professions built around control, but the oppressed have often been forced to learn from the machinery built against them. A chain can teach metallurgy, a patrol can teach route logic, a bounty poster can teach how records are kept. The moral stain belongs to the system that made such knowledge necessary. By late 1859, Elias had become something Bayou Marrow had never intended to produce. A black man trained in pursuit, disciplined by pain, and held together by one unburied fact. Naomi had been sold. He still did not know where she had gone after Natchez. He had no proof beyond the final bidder's name and his own memory. But memory had not weakened, it had sharpened. Every year that passed stripped away panic and left structure. He was no longer simply a husband running from loss. He was a witness turning himself into an instrument. And somewhere ahead, whether in Louisiana, Mississippi, or farther east, men who had once raised hands at an auction were living as if the crowd had protected them. They were wrong. By the winter of 1860, Elias Voss had stopped thinking like a fugitive and started thinking like a ledger keeper of the damned. That distinction matters. A fugitive runs from pain. A ledger keeper preserves it, sorts it, links it to names, places, dates, and profit. He does not let violence dissolve into atmosphere. He pins it down. He records who benefited. He remembers who watched. He learns who signed. That is how hidden crimes lose the protection of vagueness. Elias had spent nearly 2 years moving under borrowed names. Eli Cross in Tennessee, Jonah Vale in Arkansas, once even Samuel Reed on a freight list out of Memphis. By then he understood something the men of the auction world had long relied on. Most suffering disappears because those who endure it are denied the means to document it. No papers, no testimony admitted, no lawful standing. No archive except memory. So Elias trained memory until it behaved like evidence. He began in Helena, Arkansas in December 1860, working nights near a river warehouse owned by a cotton broker named Philip Darrow. Darrow's clerk, a narrow-shouldered man with a whiskey cough, liked to boast after midnight that trade records could tell the whole moral history of the South if anyone were wicked enough to read them honestly. He meant it as a joke. Elias took it as instruction. For 6 weeks he swept floors, loaded crates, and listened. He learned which commission houses handled private sales after public auctions. He learned how traders disguised transfers by routing paperwork through creditors, factors, and plantation agents. He learned that names changed spelling from one parish to the next, but money left cleaner tracks than men did. Bills of sale, freight charges, hotel ledgers, mule rentals, warehouse entries, notary seals. The respectable world had built itself on paper while pretending paper absolved blood. By February 1861, Elias had moved south again, this time through Monroe, Louisiana, using a forged reference from a levee foreman who had never bothered to verify identities as long as a man could work. He was no longer asking wild questions about one woman sold years earlier. That would have exposed him. He asked about routes, trading houses, known buyers, the habits of men with money. He learned patience because reckless grief gets caught. The men he hunted had relied on panic from the people they broke. Elias understood he would have to deny them that comfort. He built each target as if assembling a case. August Renshaw came first on paper, though not yet in blood. Renshaw of Iberville Parish. Sugar planter, widower, heavy card player. Known to spend late Saturdays at the Magnolia Club in Plaquemine whenever he was not in New Orleans during shipping season. Maintained a mistress in secret lodgings behind a bakery on River Street. Walked with a cane more from vanity than need. Paid in coin when drunk, credit when sober, cruel to debtors, careless with servants. Elias learned all this not from one source, but from fragments gathered over months. A stable hand remembered the horse. A barkeep remembered the temper. A laundress remembered initials sewn into cuffs. Truth in that world rarely arrived as a single confession. It had to be reconstructed from the mouths of people the powerful never noticed. Lucian Pike required different work. Pike was not rooted like a planter. He was a moving parasite, a trader and broker who drifted between Natchez, Vicksburg, Baton Rouge, and sometimes Galveston when markets shifted. Men like him hid inside mobility. They were harder to corner but easier to hate, because everywhere they traveled they left some family broken behind them. Elias learned Pike favored river transport when carrying chained groups, but private carriages when buying for elite clients who wanted discretion. He preferred hotels with rear courtyards. He cheated in weight accounts. He kept duplicate notebooks. He hired the same 2 armed escorts when he expected trouble, a sandy-haired former overseer named Cleet Boren, and a younger man called Amos Fitch, who had once served as a deputy jailer in Warren County. Hollis Creed, by contrast, looked clean because his role was meant to look clean. He was the kind of man polite society defends after the fact. Not a trafficker, they would say. A broker, a financial intermediary, an agent. He did not shout at auctions. He did not keep chains in plain view. He financed purchases, arranged title transfers, secured temporary warehousing, located suitable labor stock for clients who did not want to be seen bargaining directly. This is why crimes of system endure so well. The dirtiest man is not always the loudest one. Sometimes he is the quiet man who professionalizes cruelty and sends invoices. By March 1861, Elias had a habit that would have looked strange to anyone watching him from a distance. In cheap boarding rooms, mule sheds, abandoned ferry shelters, and army tents, he whispered names before sleep. Not as prayer, as preservation. August Renshaw, Lucian Pike. Hollis Creed, Edwin Bale, Tom Blevins, Gerard Weller, Silas Whitmore. Then the details tied to each of them. Cane, watch chain, black coat, scar. Ledger, gallery, Natchez, May 14, 1858, $1,175. He knew forgetting was the first victory oppressors count on. He refused them that. Then the country lurched toward war. The spring of 1861 changed the surface of everything without cleansing the core. Secession speeches filled newspapers. Militias assembled. Men who had built fortunes from slave labor began calling themselves defenders of liberty. That contradiction should never be repeated without disgust. Liberty for the owner, chains for the owned. Political language in the South was often nothing more than moral camouflage stretched over commerce and flesh. For Elias, the chaos created openings, records moved, men traveled. Muster rolls, supply contracts, cavalry purchases, and county requisitions produced fresh paperwork and looser scrutiny. A black man still faced mortal danger in motion, but the landscape of surveillance had shifted. White men were increasingly distracted by uniforms, allegiances, and military speculation. In confusion, patterns slipped. Elias used that. In June 1861, he hired on with a livestock contractor near Jackson, Mississippi, where he spent 3 months hauling feed and remount stock between camps and plantation districts. The work put him on roads respectable men used when they thought their business too sensitive for public stages. He began marking habits more precisely. Who traveled armed, who drank before dusk, who trusted the same ferryman. Which inns separated wealthy guests from drivers and hired hands. Which plantations kept private watchmen. Which households dismissed servants on Sundays. The mechanics of vengeance were becoming the mechanics of reconnaissance. He also learned restraint. This is where lesser men fail. They confuse rage with readiness. Elias had chances, small, tempting, useless chances. Once he saw a known auction clerk step into an alley drunk and nearly alone in Vicksburg. Once he recognized one of Pike's old escorts asleep beside a stable in Baton Rouge. Once he passed within 30 yards of Edwin Bale himself outside a notary office in Natchez, older now, heavier, still dressed like a respectable accountant of human ruin. Elias did nothing. That refusal was not weakness, it was discipline. He was not hunting at random. He was building toward certainty. A dead clerk in an alley proves little. A vanished escort in a stable yard changes nothing. Elias understood that if he struck too early, the rest would vanish deeper into the network. Worse, Naomi might still be alive somewhere beyond it. Blind revenge would close doors that method could open. By October 1861, he had begun carrying a small oilskin packet sewn into the lining of his coat. Inside were scraps of paper written in several hands, none of them his. Elias wrote little himself when he could avoid it. Literacy was uneven among the men willing to help him, and possession of incriminating notes could be fatal. So he used others carefully. A sympathetic free black preacher in Greenville copied 2 names and a parish reference from memory after hearing Elias describe the Natchez sale. A mixed-race carpenter in Baton Rouge marked a rough map of river properties associated with private holding houses. A German dock worker in New Orleans, paid in labor rather than cash, wrote down the address of a warehouse company known to store people awaiting inland transfer. Each scrap was incomplete. Together, they formed structure. One line among them mattered more than the rest. Whitmore Holdings, East Feliciana route, private carriage preferred. Silas Whitmore's name had resurfaced, not as rumor alone now, but in connection with actual movement of people after purchase. The note came from an elderly teamster outside St. Francisville in November 1861, a man who remembered hauling crates, furniture, and quiet cargo to an outlying property belonging not to Whitmore's principal residence, but to a secondary house used when discretion was required. The teamster did not know Naomi. He did not know the details of the Natchez sale, but he remembered one thing clearly. Whitmore sometimes paid extra to keep newly purchased women out of public quarters, especially if he intended to hold or transfer them privately later. That detail darkened everything. Because it meant the final bidder had not necessarily taken Naomi into ordinary plantation registration. She might have been hidden, resold quietly, moved under false description, kept off the usual books. There was profit in secrecy, especially when the buyer had appetites, debts, or arrangements unsuited to open record. The slave economy did not merely traffic in labor, it trafficked in concealment. Elias shifted course after that. The hunt was no longer simply a future act of punishment. It became an investigation tied to one question: had Whitmore kept Naomi, transferred her, or buried her inside another ledger under another name? From late 1861 into early 1862, Elias narrowed his life to preparation. He avoided drink entirely. He practiced with knife and pistol whenever he found isolated ground. He learned to saddle in darkness, to move without striking spurs, to count silent beats between patrol routes. He adopted the habits of men who work dangerous edges. Never sleep twice in the same visible pattern. Never enter by the same road you leave. Never trust the man who volunteers too much detail too quickly. He let his beard change his face. He altered his gait when needed. He wore hats low and kept stories short. And he studied fear in other men. Not the fear of whips or chains, he knew that too well, but the fear of exposure. White men who could order beatings often collapsed into caution when their names risked becoming public stain. Brokers feared ledgers being stolen. Planters feared scandal crossing county lines. Traders feared clients learning they had cheated them. Overseers feared being abandoned by masters if legal trouble reached the porch. The powerful were rarely brave. They were protected. Elias saw that more clearly with each month. By February 1862, he had become something the slave market had never intended to create. Not merely a bereaved husband, not merely a runaway, not merely a veteran laborer hardened by roads, camps, and false names. He had become an auditor of violence, patient enough to trace its channels and disciplined enough not to waste the reckoning on impulse. He now knew where some of the bidders slept, where they drank, who they paid, which roads they trusted, which clerks handled their correspondence, which women they visited in secret, which parishes would hide them, which ones would sell them out if the price changed. He was no longer chasing shadows from an auction yard. He was building a map of the men who had raised their hands while his wife stood on a platform. And once a map like that is complete, blood is no longer the product of chaos. It becomes procedure. By March 1862, Elias Voss had stopped asking whether the men from Natchez deserved to die. That question belonged to churches, judges, and newspaper editors who had spent years blessing the machinery that tore families apart. Elias was no longer waiting for moral permission from institutions built to protect buyers. He had moved beyond that fraud. The question now was narrower, colder, and more practical. Which man first, by what method, and what could be learned before the next one fell? He did not begin with Silas Whitmore. Whitmore had paid the final price for Naomi on May 14, 1858, and that fact burned brightest. But Elias understood hierarchy. The man at the end of the auction chain was important. Yet there were weaker links before him, Men who talked too much, traveled too loosely, or handled records they did not know how to protect. A clean hunt is rarely a straight hunt. Sometimes you reach the deepest chamber by opening lesser doors first. The first door was a bookkeeper. His name was Martin Quill, the ink-stained man Elias had seen near the Natchez platform that morning in 1858. Not a planter. Not a trader of first rank. Not the sort of man Southern society would describe as monstrous, which is exactly why he matters. Quill was 39 in 1862, unmarried, employed off and on by commission houses and auction firms as a copyist, recorder, and settlement clerk. Men like Quill were the nerves of the slave market. They did not hold the whip in the field. They transformed theft into paper, paper into title, title into legitimacy. They made the crime look orderly. Elias found him in Vicksburg in late March. Quill had taken rooms above a grain office on Cherry Street and spent evenings at a narrow tavern called Leland's Rest, where clerks, dray agents, and warehouse men played cards under low smoke and bad lamps. Elias entered twice without speaking to him. On the third night, he sat close enough to hear Quill complain about delayed payments from plantation fools who wanted premium women without premium cash. That phrase should be preserved. It revealed the market as it truly spoke when gentility slipped. Premium women. As if the soul of a person could be grated like cotton fiber. Quill drank more than he could hold. That was his weakness. On March 28, 1862, he left the tavern after midnight, carrying a satchel too carelessly for a man who trafficked in secrets. Elias followed him through an alley behind the river warehouse district, where the mud held footsteps and the walls kept sound close. Quill turned once, sensing movement, and saw only a dark coat and a face he did not recognize. That was the last mistake he had time to understand. Elias did not shoot him. Gunfire announces panic. Panic invites witnesses. Instead, he drove Quill into the brick wall, pinned one forearm across his throat, and took the satchel first. Always the satchel first. Then he asked a single question. Whitmore. Where did he send purchased women off public books? Quill tried to bargain with denial. He named firms. He named counties. He lied once. Elias knew it was a lie because the man's eyes darted left at the wrong name. Under pressure, clerks do what ledgers teach them to do. They search for alternative entries. Quill finally gave one true thing before Elias silenced him forever. A holding house outside St. Francisville had been used for discreet transfers in 1858 and 1859, sometimes under the management of a broker connected to Hollis Creed. When Quill was found the next morning face down in the alley muck, the authorities marked it as robbery and drink. That is how societies built on systemic violence prefer to read the deaths of minor accomplices, as accidents, as vice, as isolated misfortune. But the satchel was gone, and with it went 3 folded sheets, 2 settlement copies, and 1 partial ledger index. Elias now had names beside dates, lot numbers beside buyer codes, and enough cross-reference to confirm what memory had already told him. The Natchez sale had not been a blur. It had been a chain. The second door was not a clerk. It was a broker's runner. Cleet Boren, the sandy-haired escort Elias had linked to Lucian Pike, was exactly the kind of man history too often overlooks. Not the architect of the market, but its obedient muscle. He had worked as overseer, jail guard, wagon escort, and sometime kidnapper across Mississippi and Louisiana. Men like Boren served as the hinge between commerce and terror. When a woman tried to run, they dragged her back. When a husband resisted, they beat him down. When paperwork needed enforcement, they supplied the bruise behind the seal. In April 1862, Elias tracked Boren south of Port Hudson. He found him traveling with a small mule team and 1 hired boy, carrying documents and personal effects between properties linked to Pike's network. Elias did not strike on the road. He waited until dusk, when Boren stopped at a cypress stand near a shallow creek to water the animals. There is a difference between revenge and slaughter. Elias let the boy walk away. The boy was frightened, yes, but not yet formed into the thing Boren had become. Systems recruit children early. Men still choose what they harden into. Boren died harder. Elias took him from behind with a cord across the neck, dragged him clear of the mules, and forced him into the reeds where the road could not witness. Boren fought like a man trained in domination, but not in being hunted. That is another truth worth marking. The cruel often imagine themselves strong because they have only practiced against the restrained. Faced with equal intention, they break differently. Boren knew Pike's movements, not all of them, but enough. Before Elias ended him, Boren named a safe hotel in Natchez, 2 couriers Pike trusted, and a fact more useful than any of those. Pike had once sold a woman onward after a private buyer refused to register her in his own plantation inventory. The buyer's name was not Whitmore, but the pattern mattered. Private transfers, off-book movement, layered concealment. Naomi's trail, if it existed, might lie in those shadows. When Boren's body surfaced downstream 3 days later, swollen and half-hidden in brush, there was talk of deserters, thieves, wartime disorder. War is convenient that way. It gives old criminals new weather to disappear inside. But Elias was not disappearing into chaos. He was using chaos as cover for sequence. The third door was Lucian Pike himself. Pike had always been filth in better clothes. By May 1862, he was operating between Natchez and Baton Rouge, leaner than before, nervous around military checkpoints, and still convinced that money would outlive scrutiny. He kept duplicate account books, one for public inspection and one for actual business. Elias confirmed that through a washerwoman in Natchez who serviced rooms at the St. Clair house and sometimes found loose papers left open by careless men. Pike liked the back staircase. Pike liked room 7 when he could get it. Pike kept a false-bottom travel trunk. Pike believed servants saw nothing. Men like him built their confidence from contempt. On the night of May 14, 1862, exactly 4 years after Naomi's sale, Elias entered room 7 through the balcony shutters. Dates mattered to him, not as superstition, as reckoning. Pike woke half-drunk, reaching for the pistol on the side table, but Elias had already moved it. He lit the lamp himself. He wanted Pike to see. Not the face, not fully, just enough of the eyes, enough to force recognition of consequence, if not identity. What passed between them was not confession in any noble sense. Pike was incapable of that. It was inventory under duress. He admitted handling transfers from Natchez buyers to inland properties. He admitted using Creed's brokerage channel for discreet title work. He admitted that certain women judged too noticeable or too troublesome for standard registration were sometimes moved under altered descriptions. Age changed, complexion simplified, skills rewritten, names replaced. This is what the market did when ordinary theft did not sufficiently bury a person. It falsified their very outline. Then Pike said one phrase Elias had not expected. Whitmore kept one. Kept one. Not sold onward immediately, not entered plainly. Kept. Pike tried to recover himself after saying it, claimed he did not remember more, claimed dates were blurred, claimed war had scattered papers. But the phrase had already landed. Whitmore kept one. Elias did not need the rest of Pike's excuses. He needed only to know that the final bidder had deviated from routine, and that Naomi might have been the deviation. Pike died with his duplicate ledger open on the floor. Elias took the smaller book and burned the larger. A message and method. Public accounts lie, hidden accounts matter. By morning, the hotel staff found a body, a scorched carpet, and a city eager to blame wartime criminality for what was in fact a private audit long overdue. Hollis Creed remained. Creed was more careful than the others. He kept distance from visible dirt. He operated through offices, proxies, carriagemen, notaries. Men like Creed do not believe themselves guilty because they do not touch the chains directly. But abstraction does not cleanse a crime. It perfects it. The broker who places the buyer, masks the root, and cleans the title is as responsible as the man who raises the hand at auction. Elias reached Creed in June 1862 outside Baton Rouge, not in his office. Not under clerk light and polished wood. In a coach yard at dawn, where Creed had come to inspect horses before riding east on business. Elias watched him from the shadows between feed bins and knew, almost with disappointment, that men who build profit from human dispersal usually die looking smaller than their reputations. Creed did not fight long. He feared pain more than shame. Under that fear, he gave what Quill and Pike had only circled, an address near St. Francisville tied to a secondary Whitmore property and a name used in private correspondence, Maison Rouge. Not a plantation listed for show, a holding house. Creed insisted he had not visited it personally. That may even have been true. Men like him prefer to commit major sins by memorandum. When Elias left the yard, Hollis Creed was slumped against a post with his throat opened by the same knife he had once helped conceal behind notarized language. No speech, no spectacle, just removal. By midsummer 1862, 3 men from the orbit of that Natchez sale were dead, and each death had yielded more than blood. From Quill came records, from Boren came routes, from Pike came the first direct indication that Whitmore had privately retained a woman outside ordinary channels. From Creed came a place. Maison Rouge. That name now sat in Elias's mind beside May 14th, 1858, $1,175, and Silas Whitmore's raised hand. The hunt had changed shape. Until then, vengeance had been the visible engine. Now rescue, or at least truth, pressed up beneath it. Naomi might still be alive, or she might have been held, renamed, broken, buried in some hidden register or unmarked ground. But the path was no longer theoretical. It had a road, a property, a man, and a pattern of concealment. And that is what the buyers at auctions never understand. They believe the sale ends with the hammer. They believe the crowd absorbs responsibility. They believe paper outlives memory. Sometimes it does. And sometimes one man survives long enough to prove that every raised hand can be counted back, one by one, until the final bidder has nowhere left to hide. By July 1862, Elias Voss was no longer moving through rumor. He was moving through structure. That change matters. Rumor keeps hope alive, but structure tests it. A whispered name can sustain a man through years of hunger and false identities. An address, a transfer pattern, a holding house, a repeated method, those things do more. They expose intent. They strip the slave market of its favorite disguise, which is confusion. Men like Silas Whitmore survived by ensuring that too many transactions overlapped, too many names changed, too many roads crossed. Confusion was not a side effect. It was design. Now Elias had a name and a place. Maison Rouge, a secondary Whitmore property outside St. Francisville, used not for ordinary plantation display but for concealment. He did not rush there. That restraint is worth noting because lesser stories often mistake speed for courage. But a man who had survived auction yards, swamp flight, labor gangs, and 2 years of stalking predators understood a harder truth. When a wife may still be alive, reckless revenge becomes another form of betrayal. Elias had already killed men connected to the sale. He could not afford to kill the truth with them. He spent the second half of July gathering the perimeter of Maison Rouge without touching it. The property sat roughly 9 miles northeast of St. Francisville, beyond a split in the Port Hudson Road where pine gave way to heavier oak and neglected cane. It was not grand in the public sense. Whitmore's principal residence carried that burden. Guests, ledgers, servants in visible rows, carriage arrivals recorded by neighbors. Maison Rouge did something else. It sat back from the road behind a line of pecan trees and a rust-colored brick wall low enough not to impress, high enough to conceal. A 2-story house with faded red plaster, detached kitchen, carriage shed, small stable, and 3 outbuildings that had once been storehouses. No field gangs. No broad cotton spread. No visible production to justify the expense. That alone marked it as suspicious. In the slave South, a property that did not openly produce often privately held what men preferred not to explain. Elias watched for 6 days from different angles. He counted lamps after dark. He mapped servant movement before dawn. He noted which windows stayed shuttered in heat. He tracked supply wagons. He measured the rhythm of the guards, because there were guards. 2 white men rotating the front and side grounds, not plantation overseers exactly, more like hired retainers. One heavy through the shoulders with a limp in his right leg. One younger, raw-boned, careless with tobacco ash. By the 3rd day, Elias knew their patrol loops overlapped poorly at the rear well yard just before sunrise. He also saw something more disturbing. No enslaved field laborers worked the property, but women moved inside it. Not many. Never more than 3 visible in a day. One older woman in a gray wrap carrying wash water. One younger woman with a yellow headcloth crossing from the kitchen yard to the back steps. Once on July 24th, a 3rd figure at an upstairs window, gone almost before the eye could trust it. The movement was slight, but Elias noticed because she had paused too long to be house staff merely passing through. She had stood there like someone measuring distance to a road she was not permitted to reach. That figure could have been Naomi. Or grief could have made him invent her. He knew the danger of both possibilities. Men on the edge of revelation often become vulnerable to hallucination disguised as certainty. Elias forced himself back into method. Height difficult to judge, build slender, posture erect despite briefness. No clear face. No conclusion. In St. Francisville, he worked the town quietly. A blacksmith's apprentice mentioned that Whitmore sent special provisions to the country house twice a month. Better flour, coffee, lamp oil, medicines. A grocer's widow remembered being told never to ask how many ladies were being kept there. A free black carpenter, old enough to have learned survival through selective hearing, said the rear upstairs rooms had been altered in late 1858 with inside locks installed on the corridor side, not the bedroom side. Locks turned inward by the jailer, not outward by the occupant. The architecture itself testified. Then came the first hard documentary link. On July 29, 1862, Elias intercepted a carriage clerk outside St. Francisville ferry landing, not by violence at first, but by staged misdirection. A dropped crate, a wheel jam, a quick offer to help. While the clerk cursed and tugged at the axle, Elias lifted a folded dispatch from the seat pocket and copied its key lines by memory before returning it unnoticed. The note referred to the woman from Natchez being still unsuitable for transfer owing to temperament and memory, and instructed that Dr. Fenwick's sedatives be continued if agitation resumes. The woman from Natchez, not a name. Men like Whitmore preferred to erase names once ownership became inconvenient. But the phrase struck like iron. Elias had been carrying Natchez in his head since May 14, 1858. Here, 4 years later, in private correspondence tied to Maison Rouge, was proof that at least one woman acquired there had remained in hidden custody long after purchase. Still, proof of a woman from Natchez was not yet proof of Naomi. The next layer came through the doctor. Dr. Bernard Fenwick was 51, Scotch-born, discreet, and morally rotten in the clean professional way that slave societies rewarded. He did not run auctions. He did not crack whips in public. He supplied tonics, signed certificates, treated plantation injuries, and made himself useful wherever wealth needed medicine stripped of conscience. Men like Fenwick are rarely given the condemnation they earn. Yet without them, countless crimes become harder to sustain. Sedation, false diagnoses, quiet confinements, these also belonged to the architecture of slavery. Elias followed Fenwick on August 2nd from town to Maison Rouge. The doctor rode alone in a dark gig, carrying a leather case and staying less than an hour. When he emerged, Elias was close enough through the trees to see something in Fenwick's manner he had learned to trust more than words, irritation mixed with unease. Not the calm of routine treatment, the discomfort of a man maintaining a difficult secret for difficult pay. That evening, Elias entered Fenwick's surgery after closing, not through the front, through the rear coal door, where medical waste was taken out. The doctor returned unexpectedly, perhaps for forgotten instruments, and found himself staring at a pistol muzzle in lamplight. Elias asked one question first. "How many women are held at Whitmore's Red House?" Fenwick lied. Elias struck him across the mouth with the pistol butt and asked again. This time the doctor answered in fragments, the coward's pattern. 2 women currently. 1 older domestic, 1 acquired woman kept under supervision for nervous instability. He insisted he did not know her original name. Elias pressed harder. Fenwick finally admitted there had once been 3, but 1 had been transferred in 1860. The remaining woman, the troublesome one, had resisted renaming, refused intimacy, attempted self-harm twice, and continued to identify herself by a husband's claim. That phrase settled it, a husband's claim. Naomi had not disappeared into obedience. She had remembered him too. Fenwick produced more under fear than he ever had under oath or prayer. The woman at Maison Rouge had been referred to in Whitmore correspondence as Nora for household use, but resisted the name. She had arrived from Natchez in May 1858, was judged unfit for open social presentation, and had since been kept partly isolated because Whitmore considered her defiant in a manner that disturbs the others. The doctor had prescribed laudanum more than once, not for illness, but for management. Management, the language of respectable cruelty again. Elias did not kill Fenwick immediately. He needed one more thing, layout. The doctor gave him enough. Upstairs rear room for the woman, corridor lock, side stair sometimes used by Whitmore during private visits. Kitchen staff asleep in detached quarters, guards usually reduced to 1 active watch after midnight unless Whitmore himself was present. Fenwick did not know when Whitmore would next come. But he knew this. Whitmore had grown increasingly possessive since spring 1862 and had refused suggestions to transfer the woman elsewhere despite security concerns caused by war. Possessive. That word revealed the final obscenity. Naomi had not merely been purchased, she had been withheld, hidden as a private spoil outside ordinary ledger flow because Whitmore wanted control more than liquidity. After extracting what he needed, Elias bound Fenwick to his own chair and left him alive, though bloodied and shaking. Some men deserve death. Others deserve to live long enough to understand they served evil professionally. Fenwick would wake to that knowledge, though whether conscience ever pierced him is another matter. By August 4, 1862, the hunt had changed shape entirely. Until then, Elias had followed a sequence of punishment leading toward possibility. Now possibility became dominant. Naomi was alive, not in freedom, not in safety, but alive. 4 years after the auction, after all the false trails, all the broker lies, all the off-book transfers and paper disguises, she still existed within reach of his hands. That discovery did not soften him. It made him more dangerous. Because vengeance can be delayed, rescue cannot. He spent the next 3 nights preparing the entry. He cached water and cartridges in a hollow log half a mile east of the rear wall. He marked 2 fallback routes, one toward the wooded creek bed, one toward an abandoned indigo shed farther north. He observed which servants might raise alarm and which moved with the defeated silence of the coerced. He chose the hour before dawn, when men are least heroic and systems most fragile. He also confronted the possibility he had avoided naming. Naomi might no longer know him. Sedation, confinement, repeated coercion, years of isolation. These break memory in some and sharpen it in others. He would have to enter not only against guards in Whitmore, but against time itself. On August 6th, while watching from the pecan line, Elias saw Whitmore arrive. Black coat even in heat, same economical posture. Same controlled movement he had first seen in Natchez on May 14, 1858, when a raised hand turned a wife into purchased property. Some men age into softness. Whitmore had aged into tighter discipline. That made him, in a way, easier to read. He still believed control could keep consequence at bay. He entered Maison Rouge at dusk and did not leave by midnight. That settled the timing. The final bidder was inside the holding house with the woman he had bought 4 years earlier. The auction was no longer a memory spread across roads and bodies. It had narrowed to a single house, a single locked room, and a single man whose wealth had allowed him to treat stolen life as a hidden entitlement. This is what every ledger, every broker, every guard, every doctor, every polite accomplice had protected. Not commerce, not order, a prison built around one woman's refusal to disappear. And before the week was over, Elias Voss would cross the wall and force that prison to answer for itself. Before dawn on August 7, 1862, Elias Voss crossed the rear wall of Maison Rouge with a pistol, a knife, a coil of cord, and 4 years of memory sharpened into purpose. The wall was lower behind the kitchen yard, where the brick had cracked under roots and weather. Elias had measured that weakness for 3 nights. He went over without sound, dropped into damp grass, and held still long enough to hear the house breathe. 1 lamp burned on the upper floor. Another glowed faintly through the side hall below. No voices outside, no dogs. Whitmore trusted walls, money, and fear to do the work of an army. Men like him usually do. The first guard came into view near the rear well, yawning, musket loose in his hand. The patrol pattern had not changed. Elias moved from shadow to shadow until the man turned his head toward the kitchen shed. Then he closed the distance and cut the struggle short. No speech. No warning. The body was dragged behind stacked wood before the blood could spread where dawn might find it quickly. The second guard was harder. He was the younger one, raw-boned, restless, careless with ash, but not entirely witless. Elias found him on the side path near the carriage shed, pausing to relight a cigar. He saw movement too late and got one hand to his pistol before Elias struck his wrist aside. The shot tore harmlessly into the dark, loud enough to wake the house, and the 2 men crashed into the dirt among harness hooks and feed sacks. Elias felt the man's teeth catch his forearm. He drove the knife upward under the ribs and held it there until the body emptied its strength. The shot changed everything. A woman screamed inside the detached kitchen quarters. A lamp flared in the main hall. Someone upstairs moved fast. The house had slipped from surveillance into alarm, and alarms favor those who already hold the doors. Elias ran for the side entrance before the remaining seconds collapsed. The corridor smelled of lamp oil, old plaster, and medicine. He passed one terrified servant pressed against the wall, an older black woman clutching her shawl to her throat. He did not stop for explanation. He only said, "Upstairs, the locked room." She stared, then gave the smallest motion of her chin toward the back stair. In houses of coercion, even a glance can become testimony. Elias took the side stair 2 steps at a time. At the upper landing stood Silas Whitmore, black coat thrown over a nightshirt. hair disordered but posture still controlled, as if outrage itself should obey him. He held a pistol low and steady. In the lamplight, he looked older than in Natchez, leaner through the face, but the eyes were the same, pale, exact, trained to evaluate possession. He recognized Elias not by name, not yet, but by type, the returning wrong he had assumed the market could erase. "You," Whitmore said. It was not fear in his voice. Not initially. It was irritation. The master's oldest reflex. How dare the purchased past walk back through the door? Behind Whitmore, at the end of the corridor, Elias saw it, a heavy lock fixed to the outside of the rear room. A prison described in hardware. "You took her in Natchez," Elias said. Whitmore raised the pistol a fraction higher. "I paid for what was sold." That sentence deserves to be remembered whole. Not because it was unusual, but because it was pure. It contained the slaveholder's entire moral fraud inside 8 words. "I paid. Therefore I may own. Therefore law has cleansed theft. Therefore purchase cancels personhood." Men like Whitmore built their souls around that logic and called themselves civilized. Elias fired first. The shot struck Whitmore high in the shoulder and spun him against the corridor wall. He did not fall. He fired back wild, the ball chewing plaster beside Elias's head. Then the pistol was empty, and the distance between them vanished. They hit the floor hard, half in blood, half in splintered wood from a side table overturned in the struggle. Whitmore was not a field brute. He had never needed to be, but men who rule by command still learn certain violences up close. He clawed for the dropped pistol, drove a knee into Elias's side, and reached for a brass candlestick to crush his skull. Elias caught his wrist and slammed it once, twice, against the floorboards until bone gave. Whitmore cried out then, not with remorse, with wounded disbelief. He had spent years believing the structure around him was natural. The house, the guards, the doctor, the private name, the locked door, each layer had taught him that consequence belonged to other men. Now it had entered his hallway and put hands on him. Elias pinned him by the throat. "Is she alive?" Whitmore tried to spit blood and dignity together. "She was never yours under law." Elias drove the knife into Whitmore's thigh, not deep enough to kill, deep enough to end the pretense. "Is she alive?" This time Whitmore answered because pain strips ideology faster than argument. "Yes." One word, enough to move the world. Elias left him bleeding and went to the locked door. The key was on Whitmore's belt, caught under his body. Elias tore it free, crossed the corridor, and forced his own shaking hand to fit the iron cleanly into the lock. That detail matters. The hand shook not from fear alone, from proximity to truth. A man can survive whipping, swamp fever, pursuit, hunger, and murder, but there is another terror in being seconds away from the thing grief has kept alive for years. Hope can break a man more violently than despair. The lock turned. The room smelled of stale linen, candle wax, and laudanum. At first he saw only the shape near the window, a woman standing back from him, thin in the shoulders, dress plain and faded, one hand braced against the wall as if still expecting orders from outside the door. Then she turned, Naomi, older, sharper through the face. A pale scar near the temple he did not know, eyes darker from what they had seen, but unmistakably hers. For one suspended second neither moved. 4 years of separation, confinement, false names, sedation, and survival stood between them like another wall. Then she said the only thing that could have come before any embrace, any tears, any redemption. "I kept your name." That was her first act of resistance and her last proof of identity. Not a dramatic speech, not collapse, not miracle, a record. "I kept your name," against Whitmore's renaming, against the doctor's management, against the private house and the corridor lock, against the market's entire machinery of erasure. Elias crossed the room and took her in his arms, and even then it was not softness that defined the moment. It was recognition under damage. They were not restored people. They were surviving evidence. There was no time to linger inside it. From below came shouts. A servant had run. Perhaps a neighbor had heard the shot. Perhaps the kitchen quarters had fully roused. War had loosened law in many places, but not enough to make dawn safe for fugitives carrying blood behind them. Elias pulled Naomi toward the door. She stopped only once, long enough to look past him at the corridor where Whitmore still struggled to breathe. "He kept me upstairs when guests came," she said. "When I would not answer to Nora, He used the medicine. No tears, just testimony again. Whitmore had dragged himself halfway toward the stairs by then, one hand streaking red across the boards. He looked up at Naomi not like a penitent man, but like a proprietor watching property revolt. That too should be named clearly. Some men do not lose their delusion even while dying. Ownership had become Whitmore's religion, and religion rarely yields gracefully. Naomi saw the pistol near his hand before Elias did. She moved first. The shot from her hand hit Whitmore in the chest and threw him back against the corridor wall beneath the lamp. He slid down, leaving blood across plaster the color of old bone. The final bidder, the man who had raised his hand in Natchez on May 14, 1858, died not as a gentleman, not as a patriarch, not as a guardian of order, but as what he had always been, a trafficker in stolen life who mistook payment for righteousness. There are deaths that clarify more than trials ever could. Whitmore's was one of them. Elias and Naomi left Maison Rouge through the rear yard as gray light broke over the pecan line. The older kitchen woman opened the gate without a word. That gesture belongs in the record too. Systems of terror never hold by force alone. They hold because many witnesses are compelled to keep still. But sometimes one witness opens a gate. Sometimes that is the shape courage takes. They reached the wooded creek bed by sunrise and the hollow log cache before the first mounted search passed the road. Naomi moved slowly at first. The confinement had weakened her. The sedatives had done their work over years, but by afternoon she was speaking in measured fragments, not to comfort Elias, not to decorate suffering, but to preserve sequence. Held at Maison Rouge from May 1858 onward. One attempted transfer in late 1860 canceled after she bit a driver and injured another woman during the loading. 2 suicide attempts the doctor called instability. 1 winter fever in 1861. 1 burial behind the rear storehouse of another woman, young, perhaps 17, who had not survived long captivity. Whitmore visited irregularly, more often after drinking, more often when war unsettled the roads. Naomi learned to count time by horses, lamp oil deliveries, and church bells from too far away to guide escape. This is the other half of rescue stories polite retellings often bury. Saving a person does not erase what was done to them. Freedom from a locked room is not freedom from memory, touch, sedation, humiliation, or the knowledge that years were taken and cannot be returned. Elias understood that. Naomi understood it better. They did not speak like lovers from a sentimental novel. They spoke like 2 people reconstructing a crime scene while trying to remain alive inside their own bodies. By August 10, 1862, they had crossed westward through woodland routes and reached a contraband camp near Baton Rouge, where Union movement and wartime confusion created enough instability to disappear inside. There, for the first time since Bayou Mero, Naomi slept without an outside lock on her door. Not all reckonings end with reunion. Many do end too late. This one did not, but it still closed in blood. Gerard Weller, Edwin Bale, Tom Blevins, Martin Quill, Cleet Boren, Lucian Pike, Hollis Creed, Silas Whitmore, some dead by Elias's hand, some by Naomi's final shot, all tied back to one sail in Natchez beneath a clear sky where respectable men once lifted fingers and palms as if human ruin were merely business. That is the circle that closed. Not because justice was complete, it was not. The dead child, Mercy, did not rise. The years in confinement were not restored. The larger system remained monstrous and alive in 1862, still feeding on black bodies even as war cracked its frame. But a record had been forced into the dark. A husband had remembered. A wife had kept her name. The final bidder had been made to answer inside his own hallway. And that matters. Because markets count on forgetting. Because cruelty survives by paperwork, euphemism, distance, and the lie that whatever was purchased was therefore permitted. This story exposes the opposite. Every raised hand can be traced. Every polite accomplice belongs in the record. Every hidden house has an address. Every stolen person has a name that ownership cannot morally cancel. If you're listening from Mississippi, Louisiana, Tennessee, Arkansas, or anywhere the old auction roads once ran, subscribe and comment with your location. And tell me your theory. Was Whitmore always planning to keep Naomi hidden for himself, or did her refusal to break make him turn a purchase into a private prison?